The Megali Idea was a political concept of the unification of all Greeks living in the Balkan Peninsula, the Aegean Islands, Cyprus, and the coast of Asia Minor. Constantinople was to become the capital as a symbol of the continuity of the Byzantine Empire, which had not existed for several centuries. The most prominent supporter of this idea was Eleftherios Venizelos. As far as history is concerned, at the end of the 18th century, a national revival began to emerge in the territories inhabited by the Greeks. The Greek national revivalists consisted of two rival wings. Western Philhellenism was based on anti-clerical and liberal ideas, and especially admiration for ancient Hellenic culture. And Eastern Fanariots, based on patriotism, Orthodox faith, and desire to restore the Byzantine Empire. Dissatisfaction with rampant corruption and very aggressive Islamization eventually led to the unification of both these wings, which resulted in the Greek War of Independence of 1821. After 9 years of bloody fighting, the Greeks, with the assistance of Russians, British and French, succeeded in freeing themselves from the ridiculous Ottoman Empire. The First Hellenic Republic included only the Peloponnese Peninsula, Attica and the Cyclades. Most Greeks were still living outside the territory of the Greek state. In fact, at the time there were many more Greeks living outside of Greece than in it. Therefore, tendencies to create a greater Hellenic state, including all the territories inhabited by Greeks, naturally began to arise. The most famous idea was the Megali Idea, which began to come true during the First and the Second Balkan Wars. After the outbreak of the Great War, the Kingdom of Greece remained divided and neutral for a long time, with the people and the government led by Eleftherios Venizelos sympathized with the Entente, and the royalists headed by Greek Constantine I, who was a relative of the German Emperor Wilhelm II, sympathized with the Central Powers. After King Constantine I's abdication in 1917, the Kingdom of Greece, led by the new king Alexander and Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, entered the war on the side of the Entente. In September 1918, the Greek army managed to break through the enemy's defenses on the Macedonian front. Thanks to this operation, both Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire were willing to enter peace negotiations. Later, Greek troops entered the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople. Thanks to Venizelos' diplomatic efforts, it was possible to obtain western and eastern Thrace, the Gallipoli Peninsula and the west coast of Asia Minor for the Kingdom of Greece. Unfortunately, apart from the Greeks, British and Armenians, no one took this fact seriously. On the territory of the disintegrating Ottoman Empire, a Turkish national movement led by Mustafa Kemal, who later became known as Atatürk, arises. The Greek army decided to utilize this movement to further expand into Asia Minor, which turned out to be a big fundamental mistake early on, bleeding both the Greek army and the Greek economy. Territorial expansion was accompanied by economic stagnation and great loss of life at the beginning, which resulted in a decline of the popularity of Eleftherios Venizelos and his liberal party. The naive prime minister decided to call new elections, which eventually led to the victory of the royalists and the return of King Constantine I in 1920. Despite the promises, the campaign into the interior of Asia Minor continues. Due to the departure of the Entente states from the Kingdom of Greece, logistical problems, a depleted army, and the subsequent dismissal of some officers, the war began to develop in the favor of the Kemalists. In August 1922, the Turkish movement launched a massive counterattack, which also resulted in the occupation of Izmir and the burning of the Greek and Armenian parts of the city. With that, chances of the Megali Idea coming into fruition were burned forever. We must not forget that the Turkish national movement was heavily supported politically, materially and economically by Soviet Russia, which saw Mustafa Kemal as a welcome ally. During the years of 1920-1922, the Bolsheviks delivered over 40,000 rifles, over 300 machine guns, 50 cannons, 2 patrol boats and over $1 million rubles to Turkey. Against such a well-armed Kemalist army, Greece had no chance without any foreign support. In general, the conquest of mountainous terrain, which is at the time unknown to the advancing forces, represented a very difficult task. The Turks, for whom central Turkey was their home, had clear idea of where best to defend, where to attack supply routes and where to counterattack most effectively. To summarize, this whole campaign into the interior of Asia Minor was completely unnecessary, costing many hundreds of thousands of innocent lives, not only Turkish but also Greek ones. The Megali Idea, which was almost fulfilled, ended in a humiliating disaster. But what would it look like if the Liberal Party led by Eleftherios Venizelos decided to settle for territorial gains and not expand any further? Could the Kingdom of Greece actually keep these acquired territories? The answer can be found in France, in Sèvres, where on the 10th of August 1920 the treaty was signed. If Greece had behaved more pragmatically and above all more conciliatory towards the defeated Ottoman Empire, it could have been possible to defeat Mustafa Kemal and thus create a new ally. The alternative scenario would look like this. Representatives of the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Greece, and Japan agreed that the number one enemy will be the communists from now on, especially the Russian Bolsheviks. Thus, the existence of the Ottoman Empire must be preserved at all costs. At the same time, it is necessary to ensure that the Ottoman Empire never again represents disturbance to the balance of power on the Eurasian continent. Mehmed Haji Pasha, Rija Tawfik Bolu Karabasi, and Rejat Khalis are presented with a proposal in which Eastern Thrace, the Gallipoli Peninsula, Constantinople, and the western coast of Asia Minor become the rightful territories of the Kingdom of Greece. However, as compensation, the Ottoman Empire will be allowed to retain Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. At the same time, it is allowed to keep the rest of the Ottoman army, plus the country will be not forced to pay any war reparations. Since the Ottoman Empire will not lose as much territory, there will be no such widespread radicalization of the Young Turks, which would mean less popularity for the republican-oriented Mustafa Kemal. In late 1920, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed VI signs an alliance with the Entente, in which the Ottoman Empire is guaranteed its independence, and in which it can rely on the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Greece, in an event of a civil war. The current goal was to prevent the spread of extreme left-wing ideas to the Mediterranean. In the spring of 1921, Mustafa Kemal, with the support of the Bolsheviks, succeeded in starting a revolution on the northern coast of the Ottoman Empire. This was utilized by the Red Army, which then entered the north of the empire, which was still inhabited by Armenians. Entente troops immediately came to the rescue, and by the summer, the north is back under the control of Sultan Mehmed VI. In the autumn, the Red Army is pushed beyond the borders of the former Russian Empire, and in the winter, the Ankara Convention is signed, in which the borders between the rescued Ottoman Empire and the emerging Soviet Union are drawn. Mustafa Kemal escaped to the Soviet Union at the last moment, where he became head of state of the Transcaucasian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. He is executed during the Great Purges in the late 1930s. In 1922, the Ottoman Empire becomes a constitutional monarchy modeled after the United Kingdom. As for the Kingdom of Greece, which succeeded in realizing the Megali Idea, it becomes the Prussia of the Balkans. In addition to Eastern Thrace, the Gallipoli Peninsula, Constantinople, and the western coast of Asia Minor, Greece acquired the Aegean Islands and Rhodes from Italy. This is because the allies of France and Britain forced Italy to give up these lands, or they wouldn't give them South Tyrol and Istria. This leads the Kingdom of Italy to an economic, moral, political, and social crisis, since the Italians, after the end of the Great War, only gained South Tyrol, Western Slovenia, Istria, and Zara. There is a rise of Italian ultranationalism, but also a rise of Italian socialism. As the Italian army still participated in the suppression of the Kemalist uprising and the subsequent push of the Red Army into the Caucasus, a civil war finally occurs between the nationalists led by Benito Mussolini and the socialists and communists led by Antonio Gramsci. In late 1922, with the Italian army twice crippled and the black shirts fully trained, the far left eventually won on the Apennine Peninsula. Neighboring France then responded in 1923 by occupying Italian Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. This territorial gain will satisfy the French public enough, with the exception of the French communists, so that the country will be able to recover more quickly from the Great War. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Greece becomes a prosperous monarchy, with a liberal economy and a stable currency. Although the standard of living for all residents is not quite ideal, thanks to the construction of new schools and universities, literacy is increasing rapidly, and the construction of hospitals is reducing the death rate. The Ottoman Empire is also gradually turning into a heavily capitalist state, investing heavily in the extraction of minerals, including oil. The two Mediterranean states become close partners and above all, allies, who together defend the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles from Bolshevism. At the same time, both states become refuge for Soviet refugees fleeing the communist tyranny. During the second half of the 1920s, thousands of Caucasian Muslims will find refuge in the Ottoman Empire, while Orthodox priests, Cossacks, and peasants find their new home in the Kingdom of Greece. At the end of the 1920s, the number of refugees began to decrease rapidly due to the constant presence of Soviet NKVD officers at the border. But the Soviets are not the only ones leaving their native land. Thousands of Italian Catholics flee mainly to Switzerland to avoid persecution. Fortunately, the Italian Socialist Republic does not follow the Stalinist path, and there are no such great famines as the one in the Soviet Union. The Great Depression of the early 1930s causes a chain of events. Let's start in Asia. As the ultranationalists never came to power in Italy, there is no regime from which the Japanese nationalists could draw inspiration from. Japan thus remains a constitutional monarchy, albeit still cruel to the Koreans, who became slaves to Japan since 1910. Since there is no common enemy that could temporarily unite the Chinese Kuomintang and the Chinese Maoists, a long and bloody civil war will take place. China is de facto becoming the Spain of East Asia. While Japan supports Chiang Kai-shek and his regime, the Soviet Union supports Mao Zedong. The conflict itself ends in a truce in late 1930s, in which Xinjiang becomes puppet of the Soviet Union, while the rest of China remains under the rule of the Kuomintang. Mao Zedong is executed, thus the position of Communist China begins to gradually weaken. Meanwhile, the following events are taking place in Europe. In Spain, the monarchy is overthrown, and in 1930 a parliamentary republic is proclaimed a year later. There is a violent secularization and nationalization of heavy industries. Meanwhile, the Italian Socialist Republic is constantly distancing itself from the Soviet Union and is gradually moving towards the so-called democratic socialism. The persecution of Catholics gradually weakens, and the Vatican becomes a semi-autonomous puppet city in late 1931. In 1932, after the victory of the Fatherland Front, Austria becomes a nationalist republic modeled after the Kingdom of Hungary. Subsequently, the political rapprochement of the two countries takes place. A year later, this Austrian guy becomes the Chancellor of neighboring Weimar Republic, who, with his idea of National Socialism, undertakes to protect the German people from the so-called Jewish Bolshevism. There is no ultranationalist Italy to cover the Austrian regime economically and politically. The July Push takes place, which results in annexation by the Germans in 1934. France, Italy, Czechoslovakia and Poland react to this with an early mobilization. The German Chancellor is presented with an ultimatum in which his army needs to leave Austria within 48 hours. The Chancellor stubbornly refuses this ultimatum, which leads to his shooting 24 hours later. The NSDAP apparatus is neutralized and the German army seizes power, which at the time, with some exceptions, still did not trust the German Chancellor very much. The German Reich thus temporarily becomes a military junta, headed by Field Marshal August von Mackensen. Although this may sound like an absolute nonsense made up by an overly enthusiastic Hearts of Iron 4 fan, we must not forget that we are talking about 1934, at the time when the vast majority of the German army, including the generals, did not trust the new Führer. In addition, the German monarchists were certainly not in very good relations with the National Socialists at all. What the future of Europe and the rest of the world would look like, of course, remains uncertain. Germany will most likely become an authoritarian state, maybe the empire will be restored. But in any case, there will probably not be further expansion, since the neighboring states are quite angry and the policy of appeasement has not yet begun, and probably never will. This is because the Allies would feel like giving Germany more land in 1935 is too much, since they already got Austria in 1934. This would make the Germans have a higher population than France, which would give them an advantage if there is another war. The only significant event will be the Spanish Civil War, where the Popular Front will most likely win, since there is no ultranationalist state to help General Francisco Franco become the leader of Spain. After the victory of the left wing, the Iberian state will probably become democratic socialist country, modeled after the Italian Socialist Republic. This is because the Stalins never had enough support there. As for the Kingdom of Greece, I have no doubts that thanks to the flexible policies of Eleftherios Venizelos and his successor Themistokis Soufoulis, the Kingdom of Greece was able to face the Great Depression better than any other Balkan state. Thanks to tourism, tobacco exports and a more educated population, it has gained international respect. The most special thing is the friendship with its former oppressor, the Ottoman Empire. As for how long this friendship would last, no one knows. However, I know that as long as there is a common threat, the Soviet Union, these two countries will cover each other no matter what. If a second world war starts in this alternate scenario, it would be initiated by the Soviet Union. The Soviets still claim the Baltics, Poland, Finland and parts of Romania, as they wanted to restore the former borders of the Russian Empire. It's quite likely that France and Britain will defend Poland, just like they did against Germany. The position of the Germans in this war is unknown, since if the war starts soon, I don't think that the Germans will join. This is because, without this guy being in charge, the German army will not go through the same massive secret rearmament. This leads me to think that in a possible future war, the Germans simply wouldn't be ready. Do you think that the world would go to chaos again in the 1930s? Let me know in the comments. Also, you can check out this video I made about what if Poland gave up the Danzig corridor to Germany. Does this also avoid the Second World War? Go to the video and find out.